topic for today is concepts of state, power and sovereignty, and is India's sovereignty compromised? If we look at this subject, the first thing that strikes us is, why should there be a controversy on this question? Normally, sovereignty is something pretty clear. It means independence, supreme power, not being subservient to any external power, etc. However, the matter is a little more complex than that. Where exactly does sovereignty reside among the different wings of the extremely complicated machinery which is known as a government of a state? And does this amount to compromise of sovereignty? Is there any external element which may influence the exercise of sovereignty? In fact, this is one of the most vexed questions, as lawyers say, vexed questions, on controversial topics of political science and international law. So let us look at what different pundits of this subject have said at different points of time, depending on their individual philosophies and what they have conceived, the way they have conceived the subject in the light of prevailing circumstances. This statement has often been interpreted as meaning that a sovereign is not responsible for anybody and is not bound by any laws. Now, who were the people who propounded these laws, these theories? The first one is Jean Baudin. Jean Baudin lived in 16th century France, and he had argued that sovereigns who make laws cannot be bound by their own laws. Now, a contemporary of Baudin was Hobbes in England, who said that a sovereign is bound by might rather than law. This is a slight modification, but nevertheless it's a modification of more or less in line with what Baudin had said. The English jurist John Austin of 19th century England had argued slightly differently. He had said that a supreme organ which enacts laws binding upon everybody else but not itself bound by the laws and could change the laws at will is sovereignty all right, but it is difficult to exercise such sovereignty. This fitted with the prevailing system of government in England, which was ruled by the Parliament. Austin argued this in the light of rule of Parliament, and the upshot of his entire argument was that in the whole complex mechanism of government, sovereignty resided in the Parliament. Now, things were a little different in the United States. In England, because England did not have a written constitution and its laws were interpreted by courts and made by the Parliament, things were of one type, whereas in the United States, because they had the first written constitution in the world, things were different. Say, for instance, in United States, there were developments which seemed to vest the sovereign power of the fundamental document in the Constitution. Britain did not and still does not have a constitution. United States has a very solid and almost unalterable constitution. And that is where, according to these political scientists, sovereignty resides. There was a case called Marbury versus Madison in the United States sometime in the early 19th century, which defined the right of the Supreme Court to alter or strike down a legislation which was passed by the Houses of Parliament, that is their Senate and House of Representatives. This was called the right of judicial review. Consequently, the difference among different states about what was a state's right and what was a federal right gave rise to all kinds of problems, and eventually it resulted in the Civil War. We need not go into that, but today the position is that, accepted position is that it might still be argued that this sovereignty need not be exercised by people solely by the national government, but could be divided on a functional basis between the state and federal authorities. So you see how the concept of sovereignty is changing from time to time and from country to country. Now, Professor Lasky, Harold J. Lasky, about whom we have all heard, Lasky had propounded in the early 20th century that sovereignty in any society or any state did not reside on any particular wing or any particular part of the state, but shifted from one part of the state to another part. A perfect example of this is Russia. During the rule of the Tsar, that is before 1917, before the revolution, it rested entirely in the Tsar in accordance with the principle of absolute divine right of kings. Then the whole thing changed as a result of the revolution, and eventually it came to be rested in the Communist Party, or rather the Politburo of the Communist Party, and eventually in the dictator who was dictating the Politburo. Then, after Russia bade goodbye in 1991 to the Soviet model, it shifted to Duma, it shifted to other rulers, and right now it is resting in one person, that is Vladimir Putin. So we see that there is a lot of truth in what Professor Lasky had said, that this thing moves from one wing of the state to another. Next, we have in 20th century important restrictions put on the freedom of action of sovereign states. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 established detailed rules governing the conduct of wars on land and at sea. The Covenant of the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the United Nations, restricted the right to wage war, although nobody paid any attention to it. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 condemned recourse to the right to wage war and solution of international problems by peaceful means rather than war. This process went on until the Second World War was waged, and when the war ended, there was the UN Charter, which imposed the duty on a number of member states to refrain in international relations from the threat of force. That is Article 2. However, it also said that the Charter of the UN was based on the principle of sovereign equality among all the members. In consequence of such developments, sovereignty ceased to be considered with unrestricted power. In other words, there is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty is circumscribed by all these circumstances, by the peculiarities of the state, the geographical position, the historical truths, current politics. All these things were circumscribing absolute sovereignty. Now, if we move from the domain of political science to public international law, we find a slightly different way of looking at sovereignty. Public international law, as we know, is that branch of international law which concerns itself with relations among states, as opposed to private international law. Now, in public international law, the sovereignty is often decided or defined by treaties and conventions. What are treaties and conventions? A treaty is a bilateral or trilateral arrangement among nations, while a convention is a multilateral thing, and all these define international law, all these define public international law, and thereby once again some more circumscription of the concept of absolute sovereignty come about. As the world is being compressed into a global village, the need for such circumscriptions on the concept of sovereignty are being felt more and more. Now, the question that will now arise, and which will be taken by me in the second part of the talk that I am delivering, is India's sovereignty compromised? I will first of all argue that the things that I have just now mentioned, circumscription of absolute sovereignty, do these constitute compromise of sovereignty? We shall presently come to it. Compromise of sovereignty basically is a matter of opinion, as I said. And if we look at the conventions, we will see that these are not things, at least in my submission, these are not things that will amount to compromise of sovereignty, because these are for the good of all nations. Say, for instance, the International Declaration of Human Rights. Certain countries did not abide by it. Say, Union of South Africa, which used to practice what is called apartheid, or the certain states in the United States, which used to practice racial segregation. They did not abide by the theory of this International Declaration of Human Rights, but eventually they all came about. Now, there are some states still in the world which do not abide by these things, but they are generally subject to censures in the international field, and as a result of that, some of them have come to be known as rogue states. One very current example is North Korea, formerly known as Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, which is anything but democratic or people's or republic or Korea, of course, North Korea. And it is actually a autocracy of one person or one family. But if we look at the conventions, which, as I said, circumscribe the concept of absolute sovereignty, we will find that they were enacted with the intention of helping all nations, and therefore all signatories who had signed in these conventions had done so voluntarily and for their own good. I'm just giving a few examples. Say, for instance, the Geneva Convention, conduct of war, regarding the conduct of warfare, the Berne Convention regarding intellectual property, the Warsaw Convention regarding international air carriage, the New York Convention regarding the settlement of disputes by arbitration, then the concept of European Union with its European Parliament and European Court of Justice. All these things, they circumscribe. I argue that they do not compromise. They circumscribe the idea of absolute sovereignty. Now we come to the second part of the talk, that is the question, is India's sovereignty compromised? I had earlier submitted that India's sovereignty, or the sovereignty of any country for that matter, is no longer absolute sovereignty, particularly in view of the fact that the world has now been compressed into a global village. Now we can sit in India and watch every little bit of what is happening live in some faraway corner of the world, and all this involve some kind of cooperation among different nations, which boil down to some kind of arrangement which one could argue that amount to compromise of sovereignty. But I would submit that they do not. Let's take an example one by one. Number one is membership of the United Nations. Nobody seriously argues that this is a compromise of security because number one, it is voluntary. Number two, it is to the advantage of India. And number three is all countries of the world want to be a member of the United Nations. So this one is gone. In the 1950s, I remember when I was just growing up and I was trying to understand politics. I was always interested in politics, even from my childhood. I used to see that the communists used to shout that India must come out of the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth. In fact, India had a lot of advantage at that time by being in the British Commonwealth, whereby the sovereignty, in my submission, was not compromised. But Indians had a lot of advantage in that they could travel to the United Kingdom without visa. This thing resulted in the entry of so many Indians and Pakistanis into United Kingdom that in 1959 they put an end to this thing and introduced visa for Commonwealth countries also. So as a result of all these things, the Commonwealth has lost most of its meaning. It is just a conglomeration of countries which speak English and once upon a time were part of the British Empire. So strike Commonwealth. Then there are certain treaties which India are a part of and which arose as a result of the partition of India in 1947. And these are things that require seriously looking at. The treaties have arisen because India is the upper riparian state of a number of rivers. These rivers originally were all within British India, or that is the Indian subcontinent or South Asia, and therefore there was no problem regarding them. But now, after partition of 1947, things became different. India became the upper riparian state of what? Number one, the western rivers, that is the 5 rivers of Punjab plus Indus. That is Satluj, Beas, Chenab, Ravi and Jhelum. These 5 rivers became bones of contention, particularly after India constructed dams on the Satluj River in Bhakra Nangal. Then the eastern rivers mainly Ganga and Brahmaputra, they flow into what was earlier East Pakistan and now is Bangladesh. Now this Ganga and Brahmaputra, they join together and then they flow into this landmass of Bangladesh, making it a huge delta, the biggest delta in the world. And this thing has made Bangladesh a country which is full of water, there being more water literally than land, and inland water transport being one of the preferred water means of transport within Bangladesh. Now, India obviously is chary of throttling off this supply of water into Bangladesh, but at the same time, India has its own need of water. So India had started channeling off water from the Ganga river, from the Jamuna river, not from the Brahmaputra river so far, from the Tista river, all these rivers. So as a result of this, Bangladesh protested. particularly after the commissioning of the Farakka barrage. The Farakka barrage, as we know, was conceived in the British days in order to maintain the navigability of Calcutta port, because the water that was coming to Calcutta port from the upper reaches of the Bhagirathi river was not enough to maintain the navigability, and also it resulted in salinity of water to be fed to the city of Kolkata. So as a result of this, Farakka barrage diverted water from the Ganga river through a canal which flowed into the Bhagirathi and which later on became the Hooghly river, and it took care of the problems of navigability and salinity. But Bangladesh protested. Now, I personally do not think this protest of Bangladesh is justified, because Bangladesh has its own river called Meghna, which is a very substantial river and which is almost entirely in Bangladesh. And secondly, it has supply of the Brahmaputra river, which has not been tapped by India anywhere. The only river still is a bone of contention between the two countries is Tista. And we know that lately there has been a lot of controversies between India and Bangladesh regarding Tista. Now, this problem between upper riparian state and lower riparian states is nothing new. This has happened in Europe. In Europe, if one looks at the map of Europe, one can see that particularly taking the river Danube. The river Danube flows from Germany through Austria, Hungary, Romania, and one other state possibly, into the Black Sea. But by a multilateral arrangement, it is open for river transport and also for irrigation. So if the Danube could be apportioned, the water of the Danube could be apportioned, there is no reason for the waters of the South Asian rivers being apportioned except political reasons. Now, even political reasons were taken care of between India and Pakistan by the Canal Waters Treaty of 1960, which was brokered by the World Bank, as a result of which the waters of the rivers Bias and Satluj were apportioned to India, and the waters of the river Ravi, Chenab and Jhelum and Indus were given to Pakistan. This is working satisfactorily till now, but we have been using lesser water than what has been apportioned to us, what has been allowed to us, and the present government is in favor, and I am also in favor, that India should be allowed the total quota of water that is allowed to flow into Pakistan from the Satluj and Bias rivers. Now, this is so far as the western rivers are concerned. In respect to the eastern rivers, on the Farakka barrage, a treaty was worked out between India and Bangladesh, which is so far working satisfactorily, although the fundamentalist fringe in Bangladesh, the anti-India fringe in Bangladesh, they constantly raise a din that India is robbing us of water. The other river which is flowing into Bangladesh is Brahmaputra. It has not caused any problem so far because India does not use any water of Brahmaputra. There is no barrage in India on the Brahmaputra, and no water is diverted from the Brahmaputra. It's a huge river. Those of you who have seen Brahmaputra would know what a huge river it is. It flows from it is a river which forms as a result of the confluence of three rivers, that is Sangpo in Tibet, that is China, and two other rivers, Dihang and Lohit. And these rivers together, they join to form the Brahmaputra, and it flows through India. But India has not constructed so far any barrage on the Brahmaputra, so there is no need to for Bangladesh to complain about this thing. And Brahmaputra is huge water. Brahmaputra water is huge water. In Bangladesh, the Brahmaputra is known as Jamuna, which is different from our Jamuna, of course. Now, the only river bone of contention that now remains is Tista. Tista is a water, it is a river which is born or which has its source in Sikkim, and it flows through West Bengal into Bangladesh and flows into the Brahmaputra. Now, Tista waters in the lean season are not sufficient for India. Now, Bangladesh has been complaining about it. We have constructed a barrage on the Tista in a place called Udlabari. Bangladesh has constructed a barrage further down in a place called Domar, and these two together try to make use of the Tista water, and Bangladesh complains that what they get is not enough. Now, this is not a talk on the apportionment of river waters. This is just to underline the fact that India still has certain problems with the neighboring states in regard to the apportionment of river waters. But does that mean that its sovereignty is compromised in any way? These are being resolved, these problems are being resolved as it had been resolved in the case of Farakka and Bhakra-Nangal back in 1960 and 1999. 1999 in case of Farakka and 1960 in case of Bhakra-Nangal. These had been apportioned. Similarly, the one of Tista can also be apportioned, and the entire exercise is voluntary. Therefore, I contend that in no way India's sovereignty is compromised. As I had said in the earlier part of the talk, there is no reason to think in today's world that circumscription of the absolute sovereignty of a country is possible. In fact, absolute sovereignty in the present day world is an absurdity. And India's sovereignty remains 100% India's sovereignty, sacrosanct, and we are proud of it. Thank you very much, and this brings my talk to an end. Thank you.